Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin. Chapter 19 Proposals for All. Brian came into the music room to find the ladies engaged in laughing conversation. But I don't know how in the hell I can, and realized that the group had moved on from puns to limericks. When they looked up and saw him, there was a pause in their camaraderie, and they rose immediately to their feet. "Oh, no, sit down. You all seem to be in the middle of something. Don't let me interrupt," Brian said, and smiled. "How are you feeling, Brian?" Alice asked. It wasn't an outrageous question, given that she knew exactly how precarious his situation was, but a momentary trace of annoyance crossed Brian's face. It had taken years of negotiation between him and his sister before they'd found a middle ground somewhere between "leave me alone, you're not the boss of me," and "I'm just worried about you." It was only now, when they were both in their 20s, that they seemed to have finally reached the level of "I trust you to tell me if you need something," and "I promise to tell you if I really need something." He knew his sister meant well, but even so, for just a moment, Brian had a flash of the old familiar "leave me alone." Fortunately, the adult part of his brain kicked in almost at once to remind him things had changed of late. The presence of the tailcoat, possibly the second best of the coats he had worn so far, proved a tactile reminder. Oh, yeah, right. He took his pump out of his pocket and looked at the readout from his sensor. "We should thank the cook," he declared. "The meal took only about 30 units and my blood sugar is fine." Alice seemed satisfied with that answer, but Brian realized the feeling in the room had changed. He glanced up from his pump and found the three ladies looking at the device and sharing wondering glances with each other. Emboldened by the slightly risque ribaldry of punning, Eliza was the first to speak. "Is that the device that you and your sister have spoken of, my lord?" "Yes, it is," said Brian. "Would you like to see it?" "Yes, if you please, my lord," Eliza replied, maintaining her composure with effort. In appearance, the pump wasn't anything remarkable, just a smooth, black oblong, no bigger than a snuff box, nothing special. Unless you realized the box was plastic, something hardly common in this day and age. The pump had a series of smooth buttons and a digital face, which he had just read, and from its base, a clear tube ran back to his waistcoat, and, though they had no way of knowing, under his clothes. "Is that glass?" Iris asked, frowning. Brian realized she had stepped up to Eliza's side and was looking at the tube. "Flexible glass, somehow?" Her tone was puzzled. "No," said Alice. "It's made of medical-grade plastic." The ladies looked puzzled, and Brian shot his sister a look that she took to mean he wanted to be the one doing all the explaining just now. In response, she held up her hands in a gesture of surrender. Brian held the box out in the palm of his hand so the ladies could inspect it if they chose. "Basically, this device is taking the place of one of my internal organs. In this case, the pancreas," he began. With his other hand, he touched his upper stomach. "It's right about here. In our time, when you eat, the food is converted into blood sugar, which is taken out of your blood to feed the cells that make up your body. Your body is made up of millions and millions of little cells like tiny animals that need food to live. Brian made a motion with his free hand, as if of blood circulating through his body. The ladies were rapt, and perhaps a little stunned. Not only was a man talking to them about the human body, but he was doing so calmly and with no affectation. Further, he was lecturing them, as if it were perfectly reasonable for a lady to hear such things and understand them. They glanced at Alice, who had previously shown no hesitation in setting her brother back on the right way after he had acted outrageously or crossed the boundaries of good taste. But now she had taken a seat at the piano. She was quietly riffling through some of the sheet music and trying discreetly to stifle a yawn. It seemed as if all this was commonplace knowledge. These facts were well known and beyond dispute, as if she'd heard it all before. Brian had their attention. He continued, "Now, when the blood sugar rises, the job of the pancreas is to sense this and release insulin. It's the insulin which enables the blood sugar to leave the blood and enter the cell, thereby giving it energy to do whatever it is supposed to do. Unfortunately, in my case, my pancreas has decided that it no longer wants to make and release insulin anymore, and so now I have to bring this fellow to do its work." "Do you mean my body is doing the same thing?" Eliza asked, eager to test her knowledge. "I have this pancreas, and it's constantly regulating sugar in my blood and secreting an elixir that sustains me in turn?" Brian paused. Eliza blushed, expecting a rebuke, but he only said, "That's it, exactly. Well done." With a small twisting motion, he pulled a tube 3/4 filled with a clear liquid from the pump. "Voila! Here it is, my insulin, my elixir, so to speak." He held it out, but Alice spoke up from her seat at the piano. "Please don't wave that around, Brian." To no one's surprise, Brian ignored his sister. He offered the vial to Eliza, since she was the nearest. As she reached out to take it from him, Brian said, "So this little box has this little plunger in it that pushes insulin out into my blood via this tube." "This vial is so smooth, Lord Latimer," said Eliza. "And what are those cunning little lines inscribed on it?" "Those lines help one estimate how much elixir remains, or has been consumed," said Eliza, clearly enjoying solving another puzzle. "Ah, would you ladies care to examine the vial as well?" Brian shared a small smile with his sister, one which indicated he thought this was going well. Alice smiled back a little in reply. The other two ladies quickly moved forward. "It is a scientific marvel," said Iris. She didn't reach out to take the vial and was examining Brian's face instead. "How true," said Eliza, and she would have passed the vial and the pump over to Lenora, who had remained at a distance, except Brian was still connected to the pump by the tubing. He quickly reached out to arrest the movement. "Ah, not so fast, please. I am still attached to my pancreas, as tenuous as that link is." Rather than just take the box, he took his soul self across the room in order to allow Lenora to touch it. Iris looked over to Alice in shock. "Do you mean to say that box of medical plastique?" Evidently, she couldn't help but give the word a little continental flair, even when amazed. "Is attached to his person?" "Oh, yeah, of course," said Brian. He inhaled and reached down to untuck his shirt. "Brian!" Alice's 19th century circuit breaker tripped. "The ladies will take your word for it." "My deepest apologies," Brian said, as he, too, realized this was not the time for show and tell. Lenora quickly passed the vial back to Brian with an air of someone who had been handed another person's internal organs by accident. Eliza apparently was processing all this new information, and her brow furrowed. "So, what you really need is more of the elixir in this vial?" she asked in the tone of one thinking out loud while putting a puzzle together. "That is correct," said Brian, patient and obviously interested to find out where her thoughts were leading her. "So, where does this elixir come from?" Lenora asked. "Originally, it came from the pancreas of cows, but then they found that pig pancreases were of greater strength and more compatible," murmured Alice, not entirely to herself, and then smiled sweetly when Brian heard her. Iris gave a nervous laugh. "Well then, surely that is the answer. Simply find as many cows or pigs as there are upon this estate, and consume this pancreas organ and be done with it." Under her fashionable air, she clearly had a pragmatic streak. "Alas, Lady Patten, that is not so simple," Brian replied patiently. "Taken as if it were merely food, the insulin goes into the stomach and liver, where it is turned into blood sugar. That is why this pump is needed to bypass the stomach and put the insulin directly in my blood." And here Brian patted the side of his stomach. "But would it be possible for you to ferment such an elixir if you had a supply of cow or pig pancreases to start?" Eliza's mind had become fully engaged in the problem. Alice and Brian laughed. "Honestly, we have no idea how insulin is actually made," began Alice. "It would definitely take us more time to set up an experiment than hours I have left," Brian concluded. "But it's a good thought." Iris made a gesture, then folded her hands together. "More than anything, this is proof to me that you come from a time beyond this one," she said. "I had an uncle who suffered from this diabetic situation, sugar in his urine, his doctor said. My mother took me to a lecture about it when we visited him at Bath, and though most of what they said was beyond me, I remember they mentioned the pancreas, just as you did." "What became of your uncle?" asked Eliza with easy sympathy. "He had nothing so ingenious as this box," said Iris. "He had to keep a very rigorous and strict diet, and his nurse doused him with digitalis and opium, so that he seldom had any appetite. I was only a child, and I remembered being frightened because he always seemed half asleep." She shook her head sadly. "In the end, he simply wasted away." She shook her head. "If you need your elixir, this insulin to avoid his fate," she said, "we must find a way to get you home, Lord Latimer, at the soonest opportunity." Alice decided this was the time to steer the conversation in the proper direction. "Now that the mysteries of the pancreas have been explained, wasn't there something you wanted to ask the ladies, Brian?" she prompted. "Yeah. Oh, yeah. So anyways," said Brian a little more uncomfortably, "the ladies, knowing what was coming, composed their faces with appropriately serious expressions and waited. So I think the point of all of this is to try and convince you that Brian faltered, I was right the first time. I am, we are not lunatics. And so Brian clearly was having trouble framing a coherent sentence. As, put on the spot, he tried to assemble all the background information he felt it was important to include in the proposal. Brian, focus. I showed the ladies our riddles. Alice tried to help her brother get to the proposal part of the presentation. The well-bred ladies kept appropriately serious looks on their faces, but a slight undercurrent of amusement could be detected in their body language as the siblings interacted. Brian sensed it and found it unhelpful. And that, really both of us, because we both need to go back. And so, um, watching Brian struggle with pronouns was proving to be something fascinating for both visitors and staff, a spectacle that no one dared to either comment on or look away from, and the ladies allowed themselves to smile. Frustrated by Brian's sudden lack of vocabulary or coherence, Alice felt compelled to take matters into her own hands. For a guy who wouldn't shut up yesterday, you sure picked a bad time to forget how words work, she broke in. What he's trying to say is that in order for the senders to send us home again, one of you has to agree to marry him. Yeah, Brian added, grateful for the save by the interruption, but still, clearly, mostly trying to think of his way through the end of his half-prepared speech. That, right, marriage, yeah. The ladies looked at Brian for a moment as the words sank in, and then the room was filled with laughter, so unrestrained that the chairs they were sitting on creaked. The first to recover from her hilarity was Lenora. Oh my, and I thought my first husband's proposal was lacking in ardor, she said through the subsiding laughter. At least he did say part of it himself, said Eliza with a suppressed giggle and an air of someone trying to be fair. Um, yeah, her giggle bubbled out. Marriage. Yeah, yeah, really. Lady Iris was less forgiving, but also more entertained than insulted. I think in the history of matrimony, that is the single most blundering attempt at a proposal that has ever been uttered. A clear regression of your performance skills. Can't pay the rent, shines in comparison. Blushing, Brian struggled to explain. Well, hey, I actually thought about it and thought, if I do the whole thing, go down on one knee and promise my undying love, or whatever, and then disappear in a poof of magic time travel, that would be bad for you. I mean, there you would be, thinking you found someone who liked you enough to marry you, and you said yes, and the guy just goes and disappears. That would not be nice. The ladies' faces were losing their mirth and being replaced with an air of quiet attention. So I thought, Brian continued, and Alice thought too, that the most honest thing we could do is just put it all out there. Where we are from, what are the conditions of our going home, and why it is important that it happens sooner rather than later. That doesn't explain Brian's flub of the proposal, which was exceedingly inept, Alice, ever the little sister, was careful to point out. but we do care about how this will affect you." Brian nodded, as much as his elegant collar would allow, then bent his head, apparently addressing his boots, and said with increasing conviction, "We don't want to hurt anyone. We just want to go home. But at the same time, you deserve to be treated not as a prop, but as thinking, feeling people. You, above all, deserve honesty, no matter what, so that you can make an informed decision. I can't do this any other way and feel any kind of good about myself. I mean, if Alice and I are being treated as objects, that doesn't mean we have to treat you the same way. It's the only thing I can do. So anyway, that's what I was thinking," he finished. When Brian looked up, 4 women were staring at him as if truly seeing him for the first time. In the case of Alice, this was the big brother she had always imagined. There had been signs of his existence before, but never so clearly expressed. She was really proud of him. The ladies themselves seemed almost in a daze. They were trying to reconcile the Brian and Alice they knew through the letters they had received with the brother and sister before them. As their host, they seemed not just respectable, but kindly, despite their unconventional behavior. At the same time, the things they were saying, and more importantly, the way that they treated each other and the unconscious assumptions that underlined their every act and word, lent credence to the suggestion that they belonged to a reality far removed from their current lives. These things hinted at possibilities of a universe beyond anything Iris, Lenora, or Eliza could have conceived of before. Iris was the first to speak. "I think I owe you an apology, Lord Latimer, and to you, Lady Alice," she began quietly, all of her earlier mirth absent from her voice. "You, Alice, have treated us with nothing but respect in what you clearly believe are perilous times. And now the demeanor of your brother makes far more sense. Pray, forgive me for my attitude. It was one born of ignorance. I cannot yet fathom the full truth of the matter of your presence here, but please, know, for you, both of you, I am full of the warmest regard." She gave both Brian and Alice a full curtsy. "Yes, I can only add my apologies to that of her ladyship," said Lenora simply, as she too curtsied. Eliza followed the other 2 women down, and the 3 women remained at the nadir of their genuflection. "Oh, for goodness sakes," said Brian, flustered by the turn of the conversation. Up, please. No need for that." It must be said that the lace about his wrist made for a far more theatrical fluttering of his hands, even without a specific call. Alice made a muffled sound of protest. "You've all been rationally skeptical and perfectly polite. What could you possibly need to apologize for?" Being from the future might explain his ideas, at least, on how to manage an estate in a most modern way, muttered Lenora. "But you're right. I cannot apologize for my doubts." Iris lifted her gaze, smiling in spite of herself. "I am apologizing for thinking that your brother was a madman." Alice mothered a laugh. "Oh, that," she said. "He is, kinda. You're forgiven already." "Obsessed with songs about rabbits," added Eliza. "Well, that is a song that a madman could sing," allowed Alice. "Hey," said Brian, "that song is historically accurate." And he muttered, It did win a Grammy, Brian, said Alice, not quite in a whisper, not helping. The ladies rose, and Eliza said pragmatically, "Well, then, if he must be betrothed, which of us wants him?" End of chapter 19, Proposals for All, in Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin, and read by Dan McLaughlin.